Okay. Well, welcome everybody to this colloquium sponsored by the South Asia Institute at Columbia, for those of you who are further away than New York City. I'm the director of the Institute, and I'm pleased to have Debashri Mukherjee from MISAS, who will introduce our speaker today. So take it over, Debashri.
So lovely to see everyone here today. Thank you so much for coming to our latest and very exciting talk in the ongoing speaker series that is organized by the South Asia Institute at Columbia University. Thank you especially for joining us at a very vexing and difficult time, and also a very busy time in the semester. My name is Debashri Mukherjee. I'm an assistant professor of film and media at the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia. And it is my very, very special privilege today to introduce and welcome Dr. Usha Iyer to present a talk based on her brand new book, Dancing Women, Choreographing Corporeal Histories of Popular Hindi Cinema, that is just out with Oxford University Press. But first, a very quick note of the structure of today's event. I will first introduce Dr. Iyer and her book, after which she will present an illustrated talk. And after her talk, we will take questions and comments from the audience, at which point you have two choices. You could use the raise hand function by clicking on the participants tab at the bottom of your screen, or you can type in your question in the chat box. And I will call on audience members who can then unmute themselves and ask their questions directly to our speaker if they so choose. So Dr. Usha Iyer is Assistant Professor of Film and Media Studies in the Department of Art and Art History at Stanford University. Her research and teaching interests lie at the intersection of cinema, performance, and gender studies, with a specific focus on stardom, body cultures, spectatorial desire and engagement, and the political economy of transnational media. Her new book, Dancing Women, examines the role of dance in the construction of female stardom in popular Hindi cinema from the 1930s all the way to the 1990s, theorizing and historicizing film dance, which is a staple attraction of the popular Indian film form. Now, as anyone with even the most cursory experience of popular Indian cinemas will note, song and dance have long been staples of this cinematic form. Even the films that we consider alternative or parallel or indie are often discussed and defined in terms of their relation to the song and dance structures of mainstream cinemas. And thus, a book that is specifically focused on dance, its narrative functions, on choreography and its artistic and cultural genealogies, is definitely a cause for major celebration. While it is easy to dismiss popular cinema for its emphasis on musical and choreographed spectacles, it is much harder and infinitely more productive, as Dr. Iyer demonstrates, to ask how we might write a history of dancing bodies and what this history can offer us in our pursuit of questions that are fundamental to the study of South Asia. Dr. Iyer does a deep dive in her book into the many cultural contestations and artistic influences that have contributed to a predominance of dance in film. She crafts a theoretical framework for an embodied approach to dance as work and dance as an expression of the artistic self. She also presents very useful taxonomies to demarcate different modes in which dance insinuates itself into filmic narratives, from narrative numbers to production numbers to what she terms the pure dance mode. In the process, we get a quilted history of gender politics and female sexuality in South Asia, the very particular textures of female stardom and celebrity, and the many shadow figures that populate the history of cinema and public culture in India, who still remain obscured from view. What the book illustrates most amply is that an attention to bodies and their dancing movements, conceptualized as mobilities, can spur new inquiries into cinema, into gendered labor, and histories of power and agency. With that quick introduction, I invite you to welcome Dr. Iyer with a big round of applause. Welcome, Dr. Iyer, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much, Debashri, for that warm, generous introduction that summarizes the work of the book so well, in fact. It has been a particular delight to have our books come out so close to each other and to engage with your fabulous book, Bombay Hustle. And thank you as well to the South Asia Institute, to Catherine Ewing and William Carrick for their kind invitation and all of the behind the scenes work that goes into organizing any event. And a big thanks and shukriya to all of you attending from various parts and various places, various parts of the world. The ability to have conversations beyond our usual confines. And in fact, your presence here are the silver linings to our pandemic-ridden world right now. I'm going to share my screen as I move into giving you first an introduction to the book before we move into the work of this chapter. Are you able to see the shared screen? Okay. I'm just gonna, sorry. Does it show in screen, in slideshow view?
It's showing inside the PowerPoint. It's not on the full
Okay.
screen.
Okay. Let me put it on slideshow and just have, it's the Word document that is then not showing up. Sorry, I'll get this sorted in a second. Okay. I'll begin by laying out some of the broad outlines of the book and then move to sections from a chapter that looks closely at film dance in the 1930s and 40s. Dancing Women, Choreographing Corporeal Histories of Hindi Cinema is a study of the material and cultural production of film dance in relation to the construction of cinematic narratives, performing bodies, and spectator-citizens. The book specifically undertakes an examination of film dance and female performance in popular Hindi cinema from the 1930s to the 1990s to explore how dynamic figurations of the body brought by cinematic dance forms produce unique constructions of gender, sexuality, stardom, and spectacle. In studying the dancing woman as both a discursive figure and a set of social practices, the book shifts attention from the ideological work performed by the bifurcation of narrative and spectacle in popular film grammar, which has been the focus of much scholarship. Examining the industrial practices and personnel required for attractions, quote unquote, such as dance, but also action, horror, etc., produces a different history and theorization of labor, materiality, and economies of production. Why women? Quite simply because they were the primary performers of dance in Hindi cinema until the late 1990s. The routine picturization of solo dance numbers with female performers reveals how gender plays a central role in the discourses of censorship and spectacle that animate film dance. The regulation of dance practices and movement vocabularies often marks attitudes towards and anxieties about women's visibility, mobility, and participation in the public sphere, allowing for an analysis of the place of the female protagonist within the film narrative, as well as that of the actress in public discourse. The introduction of dance into the performance repertoire of the Hindi film actress repeatedly produced fractured narratives, split characters, and doubled personas. Through a focus on genealogical and professional histories, training, and labor, the book adopts this formal fracturing and doubling as a methodological invitation to produce a different kind of narrative about female labor in the Bombay film industry, one that centers experimentation, collaboration, and mastery in the careers of Hindi cinema's dancing women. The dancer actress is employed here as an analytical category. acting as a nexus for relations between industry, narrative, and spectatorship, but also as a material artifact composed of limbs, bone, flesh, and skin. The neuromusculature of the dancing body draws our gaze to both anatomical surface and ideological depth, or indeed the reverse, to the depth of the performing body beneath its ideological inscriptions, as for instance, chaste, salacious, traditional, modern, heroine, vamp, etc. The GIFs on screen show you two examples of what has been read as a binary figuration. By charting discursive shifts through figurations of dancing women, their publicly performed movements, their private training, and the cinematic and extra diegetic narratives woven around their dancing bodies, the book considers the quote unquote women's question via female mobility, afforded by the physical movement of dance and the social movement that dancing engenders. A material history of the labor of producing on-screen dance demonstrates how dancing women of various caste, race, religious, and class configurations co-choreographed the dancescape of Bombay cinema. We have here on screen a photograph of Saroj Khan, the choreographer, Madhuri Dixit, the star from the late 80s, early 90s, but also a ring of backup dancers around them, which sort of articulates this co-choreography by multiple dancing women. A collaborative framework captures the complex transmedial corporeal history of film dance production, making visible the bodies whose labor is rendered immaterial. The labor of these ghost or shadow figures is central to the production of the dancing star, but is often pushed to the background, throwing a long dark shadow on the spotlighted histories of acclaimed film stars. Ghost figures marginalized at various historical junctures include traditional hereditary performers such as tawayafs or courtesans and devadasis, who were temple, court, and salon dancers, the cinematic vamp, the behind-the-scenes choreographer, and numerous nameless background dancers. The dancing women in today's talk, the upper class and caste Sadhana Bose, and the more shadowy figure of Azuri, a proto-vamp or item girl of Indian cinema, demonstrate that when we trace material industrial practices and logics, we begin to formulate a corporeal history that is peopled by many bodies, with agency and authorship dispersed over numerous acknowledged and invisibilized actors. Reading the dancing body as scripted and scripting Hindi cinema's signifying practices advances new histories of the female body in the Bombay film industry. Corporeal histories not necessarily forged by coherent visions and unified social groups, but relationally across axes of caste, class, religion, and region. Corporeal histories disrupt linear narratives of movement, from salon to stage to screen dance, and of hierarchies between performer and choreographer, heroine and vamp. Rather than ossified histories of media as following one after another, we follow their pleating through the bodies that inhabit and enliven these media. Corporeal histories, by their nature, are unfinished histories. Moving bodies, after all, are slippery, and embodiment is a complex mode of inhabitation of performance traditions that does not leave clear textual or archival traces. The dancing women who choreograph this narrative through movement vocabularies they introduce into cinema or remove from it, who are acclaimed and written off at different moments, hailed and forgotten, are protean figures, shape-shifting through the webs of patriarchal industrial practices, traversing foreground and background spaces, producing in the process a variegated textured history of dance, music, theater, and cinema. In today's talk, I'll focus on Azuri and Sadhana Bose. I'll close my window first. Sorry about that. In today's talk, I'll focus on Azuri and Sadhana Bose, once famous, now forgotten dancing women from the 1930s and 40s, to provide a closer look at how the book excavates and frames the cultural labor of dancing women in Indian cinema. Court dancer was hailed. These are the two figures, Azuri on the left and Sadhana Bose on the right. And I'll move on to the film that I'm talking about. Court Dancer was hailed for being the first Indian film in English to be entirely produced with an all-Indian personnel. Also released in Hindi and in Bengali as Raj Nartaki, this extravagant trilingual production was promoted as the Studio Wadia Movie Tone's most ambitious film to date. Through what has been described as an orientalized classical dance film for European audiences, studio founder JBH Wadia sought to change the image of Wadia movie tone that had until then mainly produced stunt films such as Hunter Wali, Miss Frontier Male, and Diamond Queen, to name just a few, which were extremely popular but considered lowbrow cultural products. Court Dancer was conceived to change all that with its high production values, its showcasing of Indian quote unquote classical dance, and classical dance is always in quotes through most of the book, and its acclaimed Bengali dancer actress, Sadhana Bose, a petite, classically trained dancer whose star text was seen to be in complete contrast to that of the muscular, Australian born, British Greek, fearless Nadia, the rambunctious heroine of the Wadia stunt films. And I'm not going to attempt to pronounce Sadhana Bose's name in the proper Bengali way. In 1941, as the nationalist reconstruction of Indian culture was hectically underway, it is no surprise that the culturally aspirational JBH Wadia chose to showcase classical Indian dance in his prestige project. During a period when reformist discourses drew upon various cultural forms, the newly reconstructed classical dance idioms not only became respectable themselves, but also lent respectability to other domains of public performance, such as theater and cinema. The Bengali actress-director couple, Sadhana and Madhu Bose, brought to Court Dancer their intermedial expertise spanning film, theater, and dance. Sadhana Bose, in particular, brought to the film the cultural capital of classical dance and her upper class and caste Bhadra Mohila star text. Bhadra Mohila literally translating to polite or decent lady, but referring more broadly to bourgeois Bengali women. Bose was the granddaughter of the famed social reformer Keshav Chandra Sen. Her elite social background and classical dance training aligned her with the shift in female stardom in Bombay cinema in the 1930s and 40s. As an emergent bourgeoisie decreed as disreputable or not Indian enough, the earlier Indian film actress, mainly drawn from the Muslim courtesan tradition, the Baijis or Tawaifs, or the Anglo-Indian community. However, the vulnerability of Sadhana Bose's stardom also reveals continued contestations around women's participation in the public sphere, especially as dancers and film actresses. Let's watch a bit of the expensively mounted court dance that is the central attraction of the film Court Dancer. The highlight of this dance sequence is a series of close-ups of Sadhana Bose's hands, meant to explicate certain hasta mudras or hand gestures. In his autobiography, Amar Jeeban, My Life, Madhu Bose remarks, quote, "To understand India's classical dances, one needs to have thorough knowledge about the technique, mudra, etc. of each form," end quote. The Boses employ cinematic close-ups as a pedagogical tool to educate the film's intended audience of foreign viewers and upper-class urban Indians at a time when Indian classical dance forms were being popularized precisely among these constituencies. A year after Court Dancer's grand premiere, J.B.H. Wadia's friend, the fantasy and stunt film director Kikubhai Desai, released his last film, Sheikh Chilli. This is from 1942. This film also featured a court dancer, but unlike Bose's prestige production that centrally mobilized her dancer actress star text, this B movie's court dancer was accorded no character name and no visual presence in the song booklet. The film itself, like many low budget productions, does not survive. So we only see the name of the person playing the court dancer. In a film 7 years prior, Bal Hatya, the same dancer actress is once again a nameless temple dancer. But we are afforded a full page photographic still that gives us our first arresting glimpse of the dancer, actress, choreographer, Azuri. My search for Azuri and her contributions to 1930s and 40s Bombay cinema has been characterized by the simultaneous textual narrative erasure and visual excess. In booklet after booklet, Azuri is listed as a generic dancer with no character name and no mention in the film synopses, but she bursts into spectacular hypervisibility in the images. Even as most of her films from this period are lost, these song booklets make evident that the presence of the German, Indian, Jewish, Hindu, Azuri resides in the spectacular imagination of the film, in its musical numbers rather than in its textual articulation of plot and character. Sadhana Bose, as a dominant caste, upper class Hindu star, on the other hand, dominates both the the plot, and as well as spectacle, and indeed makes the narrative pirouette around her dancing skills. So notice in the song booklet for Kumkum the Dancer, a 1940 film, her name is in the largest font. There's a photographic still of her. There's a dynamic illustration of the dancer at the heart of the narrative. There's a mention of a dancer in the title of the film. All of these serve to present Bose as the central attraction and, in fact, the authoring presence of these films that she featured in. Excavating the cinematic participation of a figure like Azuri, even more elusive than the barely traceable Bose, helps us advance new histories of the female body in South Asian film and dance. Azuri exemplifies the ephemerality at the heart of these corporeal histories in multiple ways. The dancing girl, a figure who primarily features in the cinematic interruption, as it were, of the song and dance number, has been marginal to the history of Indian and indeed most cinemas. As an itinerant dancer who doesn't appear in the rest of the film at all, Azuri is rendered invisible in the official archive. She's quite literally a shadow figure in one of her rare surviving song and dance sequences, this one from V. Shantaram's 1935 film Chandrasena, where we'll see her silhouetted form dancing on a drum. alternation between the singer-actress Rajni's face to capture her vocal performance and long shots of Azuri's dancing, the sequence produces oral and visual regimes of female spectacle. Azuri's silhouetted form emblematizes the simultaneously fetishized and invisibilized figure of the dancing girl. The acclaimed director of the film, V. Shantaram, who employed a female silhouette as the emblem of his famed Prabhat Film Company, is reported to have said, quote, "Give me a girl with a figure like Azuri's and I'll give you anything," end quote. The silhouetted lineaments of Azuri's dancing body enable her mythification as courtesan, celestial dancer, icon of spectacular femininity, while erasing the specifics of her name, her mixed race origins, and her acquisition of hybrid dance styles. My attempt has been to fill in some of these details and to return to Azuri her full substantial presence as one of Indian cinema's first dancing stars, who emigrated from India to Pakistan, from screen to stage, dexterously managing her star text between being a sex symbol and an English, Bengali, Urdu magazine columnist, demanding respect and funding for initially what she frames as Indian or Hindu, and then later Pakistani or Muslim dance forms. And I'll talk about this in a bit. As performers and choreographers of spectacular dance numbers from the mid-1930s onward, Bose and Azuri are key figures in articulating the cine-corporeal transformations of the period. Artistic pioneers who, through the conceptualization of space, movement vocabulary, and costume, contribute to a new cinematic and dance idiom, and indeed to a newly emerging mass culture. An analysis of movement and dance profoundly corporealizes social analyses of gender, including rhetoric about the public-private divide articulated during this period and earlier, highlighting the relationship between women, dance, and modernity, and placing dance not at the margins of social developments in the 1930s, but at the very heart of what has been debated as the women's question. Speaking of the 1930s, let's briefly consider the context in which Bose and Azuri begin their careers. The 1930s are a key moment for the study of film dance, preceded and marked by the abbreviation of songs for the gramophone, which begins a few decades earlier, alterations in vocal performance for the microphone, and the shortening and simplification of dance movements for Euro-American and bourgeois Indian audiences. The 1930s and 40s are a critical period for studying discursive formations around dance in particular, with the so-called revival of classical dance forms, which involved an appropriation of the cultural practices of traditional performers like Devadasis and Tavaifs by dominant caste upper-class performers. In the longer book chapter, I discuss the attitudes of anti-Nach reformers in the late 19th century, and you can see here Sadhana Bose's own grandfather's opinion on hereditary dancers, Keshav Chandra Sen's note on the opinion on the Nach question. And in the chapter, I chart as well the role of Oriental dancers like Ruth St. Denis, the prima ballerina Anna Pavlova, and dancers and institution builders like Uday Shankar and Rukmini Devi Arundel in this embourgeoisement of public dance performance. And I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A later. Devesh Soneji, in his study of Devadasis, argues that the so-called dance revival be understood in terms of new taste hierarchies that now declared the dance of the Devadasi casual, unclassical, aesthetically impoverished, and morally dubious, in contrast with a newly constructed Bharatanatyam. These binaries inflected discourses of film dance during this period as well, and especially the star texts of Sadhana Bose and Azuri that were enmeshed in these dualisms of tradition and modernity, classical and erotic dance, and dancers and dancing girl figuration. Sadhana Bose is routinely described as a danseuse and Azuri as a dancing girl. By reading Bose and Azuri's performing bodies and careers alongside each other, my aim here is to dislodge unitary accounts of the impulses and controversies around dance on film by a new class of urban performers. As dancer choreographers, composing and performing their own dances, and determining the oral and visual contexts in which these dances take place, both women prevail as intermediate artists, engaged in a radical exploration of how dance can be mobilized across various old and new media platforms. Azuri and Bose act as nodes for tracing multiple figurations that fold into the dancer actress. Reading them alongside each other contests binary figurations of heroine and vamp, Bhadramahila and sex siren, the quote unquote cultured lady of social melodrama, and the dancing girl of what has been called the bazaar cinema of an earlier period. In their spirited and skillful production of and participation in a global circuit of entertainment economies, Azuri and Bose marshaled dance to co-choreograph new mobilities in this late colonial period. I'll provide a quick sketch now of Sadhana Bose's career in film dance. Bose, those are more images of Azuri and Sadhana Bose. Bose is a striking example of a film actress in the 1930s and 40s whose stardom owed in a very great measure to her ability to dance. Only 2 of her 12 films survive, and so I use song booklets like I have here and other paratextual material to reconstruct her career. As evident in her 2 extant films, Alibaba and Court Dancer, and in song booklets and promotional materials of her other films, Bose was a dazzling performer of dance numbers, a trailblazing choreographer of group dances. You see images of 2 group dances here. And an adventurous costume designer whose creations reflect the same hybrid, quote unquote, oriental, modern aesthetic encountered in her dance. Her career as among the first and very few costume designer, choreographer, dancer, actresses in Indian cinema, or indeed any other cinema, produces a complex narrative of the embourgeoisement of dance and film cultures during this period. As Nipa Majumdar, Rosie Thomas, Kaushik Bhaumik, and others have shown, the transition to the talkie film in the early 1930s and the film industry's desire to create a more acceptable image of itself in a bourgeois nationalist mode resulted in the emergence of the cultured lady, whose educational status was highlighted in order to align the film actress with the new public role of women in the national movement. This photo feature in a 1939 magazine captioned India's 4 educated aristocratic film stars makes evident the mapping of cinematic stardom along the axis of class and often religion. All of these are dominant caste Hindu women, as a new generation of privileged class and caste filmmakers and audiences sought to quote unquote reform the cinema. One of the major areas of reform in the 1930s was on-screen dancing, particularly of the eroticized Oriental mode celebrated in the bazaar cinema of the 1920s and early 1930s. While the early talkies were marketed as all talking, singing, dancing films, the increasingly dominant discourses of respectability and social reform led to a regular condemnation of dancing and of that other form of on-screen sensuality, kissing. Trained in classical dance and music, Sadhana Bose's associations with Rabindranath Tagore through his dance dramas, Uday Shankar, Anna Pavlova, and Madhu Bose's Bhadralok or educated elite theatre group, Calcutta Amateur Players, established her as being at the center of the movement to reinvent and gentrify Indian dance forms. I've included a quote there from Madhu Bose's autobiography and spend a lot of time in the book chapter discussing his formation of this theater group that Sadhana Bose joins when she's 16. This doesn't mean that things were necessarily easy for Bose. In her autobiography, she remarks on the fraught social discourse around acting and dancing by women. It is not like theater was an acceptable or reputed thing in society, unlike now. And she's writing this in the 50s. Amidst much disrespect, at the cost of losing our reputation, hearing a lot of negative things from Orthodox households and a major section of the local print media, we had to stay fixed on our decision to be on stage, end quote. In choosing a professional career in film and dance, rather than domesticity, like her sisters and aunts who married into royalty, Bose marks a significant shift in the figuration of the educated Hindu woman. During the 1930s and 40s, dance movements were not yet as strictly codified as they would become by the 1950s, which I discuss in the chapter that follows this one in the book. In her film and stage choreography and costume design, Bose brought in elements of classical dance forms like Manipuri, but also freely borrowed from Rabindra Nritya, Western ballet, and Middle Eastern and South Asian forms. Let's watch a clip from the final dance number in Ali Baba, her debut film from 1937. The music for this film was composed by Timir Baran, who was also the composer for many of Uday Shankar's ballets, a student of Ustad Alauddin Khan, and considered a major innovator of orchestral composition for Indian stage and film music. Bose's character, Margina, who dances here, wears a fantastically hybrid costume of her own design. And likewise, her choreography is a hectic hybrid including Khmer, Cambodian, and Sri Lankan Kandi dance. Borrowing, borrowing from an international Oriental dance vocabulary, Urdu Kissa Dastan storytelling traditions, Parsi theater, newly emerging classical Indian dance forms, and Hollywood, Sadhna and Madhu Bose participate in the cosmopolitan modernity that marks the Orientalist Indian films of the 1920s and 30s, but are resolutely highbrow and employ a discourse of classicism to signal their difference from the lower brow Oriental fantasy genre that preceded these films. What I discuss as the Bose's dance socials cannily combine the attractions of salon dance, sumptuous costume and set design, literary prestige, and social melodrama to reconfigure cinematic representations of dancing women, which would then echo through courtesan and court dancer films for many decades to come. I spent quite a bit of time in the chapter on the dance social, the form of the dance social. Sadhna Bose's plays and films were promoted as neoclassical ballets and film ballets, respectively, distancing them in name and idiom from any associations with the notch. On account of her expertise in Indian dance forms, sorry. On account of her expertise in Indian dance forms and her dominant caste background, Bose was seen as symbolizing the essence of indigenous tradition, even though she freely appropriated from non-Indian dance forms and costuming traditions. A divergent mix, a divergent matrix of mixed race and Islamicate figurations marked the similarly experimental Azuri quite differently. Making her debut in the Bombay film industry in 1935 as a dancer in multiple films, Azuri, variously named Miss Azuri, Srimati Ojuri, and Madam Azuri, takes us on a rather different but intersecting journey through dance in Indian cinema of this period, the 1930s and 40s. Anna Marie Gizeller, later named Azuri, was born in 1907 or 1916. There is some debate about this. She was born in Bangalore to a German Jewish father and a Hindu Brahmin mother. Her mother's caste status is always foregrounded in Azuri's accounts. Surgeon General Gizeller, a strict disciplinarian, disapproved of quote unquote Eastern dancing, encouraging Anna to learn ballet and the piano instead. But her heart lay in the Eastern dances she watched on secret trips to the movies with her ayah or her nanny. Upon their move to Bombay, the famous Muslim reformer Atia Faizi Rahman encouraged the teenage Anna to learn Indian classical dance. The dance forms Bharatanatyam, Manipuri, and Kathak are mentioned in some accounts. Anna's identity as a dancer was fashioned further by a visitor to Faizi Rahman's Three Arts Circle, the Turkish writer and political activist Khalida Adib Khanum, who renamed Anna as Azuri. Reportedly, when Khanum heard that Anna was known by the prefix of, quote, some Devi, as a lot of women tended to be named, when, especially as public performers, Khanum scowled and announced, quote, the name should be Bhutane Osri rather than Devi, referencing Amir Khusro's allusion to the divine beauty of statues of goddesses carved by Azar, a mythical sculptor. Hindu majoritarian pressures have been understood as influencing the name changes of Muslim, Jewish, and Christian actors during this period. Madhu Bose himself writes about changing a Nautch girl's name to Madhvi, for instance, so she could be an acceptable star for his first sound film, Selima, in 1935. However, Azuri's pre-film career renaming points to a different cultural matrix of Muslim cosmopolitanism. Additionally, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many Eurasian women entertainers, including Malka Jan and her daughter Gohar Jan, changed their names, religion, and lifestyles to reinvent themselves as celebrity entertainers, as Tawayef singers and actors. Azuri may be read as part of this genealogy in a period of colonial modernity marked by new patterns of urban consumption. The retention of this name by the Bombay film industry in the 1930s suggests that Anna's new Islamicate name was actually seen as appropriate for her status as a dancing girl, recalling the quote unquote exotic dancing girls of bazaar cinema of the 1920s and early 1930s. Rosie Thomas notes of this period, quote, the subaltern bodies of the erotic arts, cabaret and nautch provided many of the female stars of India's silent cinema, end quote. In the 1930s and 40s, a Hindu renaming was only required in the construction of the bourgeois cultured leading lady, not a necessary accoutrement for a Eurasian dancing girl like Azuri. In the song booklet for Katle Aam, for instance, the dancing girl Azuri retains her name if you see the credits, while the heroine, the Jewish star Esther Victoria Abraham, appears under her Hindu screen name Pramila, reflecting the complex fashioning of female identities and performance registers on and off the screen. This image from the song booklet for Sonar Shanchar or Sonar Sansar, directed by the acclaimed Calcutta-based New Theatres filmmaker Devaki Bose, encapsulates the many complex constructions of cinematic femininity through Azuri's dancing girl figuration. In mimicking the Western ballet dancer on the poster behind her, Azuri crystallizes in this image her many figurations, the shock of her exposed legs under her nonchalantly lift ghagra or skirt, reminding us of her training in ballet, marking her mixed Eurasian heritage, and also the long history of the bazaar dancing girl. Even if the films are no longer available, the arrangement of limbs, costumes, dance poses in these images is eloquently suggestive of the many transitions dancing women and actresses were involved in during this period. The early conflation of the categories of dancing girl and sex symbol is apparent in the persistent eroticization of Azuri's star text. One reporter remarks, quote, Annette wore the most daring outfits and danced straight into the hearts of men and women. Her body, her figure became things that were discussed in every quarter, every circle, end quote. Parallel to journalists' breathless reports on her body, clothing, and dance are Azuri's own newspaper and magazine columns, which articulate a feisty resistance on multiple fronts. Indeed, what makes Azuri particularly fascinating is that through the 1930s, she writes columns on dance, actively mediating what it means to be a female public performer in the fields of dance and film, and adroitly producing different personas through her dance, writing, and her later stage career. In her 1935 column, Dance, a Sacred Art, she makes a case for Indians to bestow upon dance the respect it deserves, echoing cultural revivalists like E. Krishna Iyer, Rukmini Devi Arundale, and others engaged in the embourgeoisement of dance forms. When she works briefly in Calcutta, she writes a column in the Bengali film periodical Chitrapanji, negotiating a new film industry and cultural context, disavowing her own figuration as a westernized screen dancer and remarking, quote, these days, many film producers are compromising on dance by importing Western dances and often use vulgarity to give cheap thrills. This insults our indigenous dance forms and results in loss of respect for the art of dance, end quote. There is a telling disjuncture between Azuri's own columns that reflect her self fashioning as a respectable classical dancer and writings by others who construct a risque dancing girl persona. A 1937 photo feature on dance in the Bengali magazine Deepali includes a photograph of Srimati Azuri alongside other well known dancers like Uday Shankar, Natraj Vashi, Madam Menaka, and Ram Gopal. The range of postures, gestures, and costumes on display here reflects the variety of dance idioms circulating during this period that is marked not only by intense political and cultural nationalism, but also by a frenetic internationalism in the exchange of cultural forms. Of the celebrated Oriental dancers here, the mixed race Azuri is the only one to also feature as an itinerant dancing girl in the movies. Her multi hyphenated identity, a vehicle for border crossing between the categories of stage and screen, Oriental dance and bazaar cinema, Eurasian and Islamicate figurations. Her partner in the Radha Krishna dance featured here is the Anglo Indian dancer choreographer Tony, renamed Krishna Kumar and trained by Azuri. The dancing pair feature in musical numbers in multiple films. I'll play a short clip from Ratan 1944. तेरे बिन मेरा जिया लागे ना कहीं भी पिया हाँ लागे ना याद नहीं छोड़े तेरी दुनिया अंधेरी मेरी अब जाऊं कहाँ वो दिल को लेकर काहे दर्दिया लौटे आ वो दिल को लेकर काहे दर्दिया लौटे आ वो जाने वाले बाल मुआ लौटे आ जमना तेरा बाल मुआ बेवफा बेवफा As Azuri and Krishna Kumar dance before the protagonist couple and their family, we observe two representational regimes at work. The private exchange of glances that articulates the principal couple and a public vocalizing of their emotions by the professional dancing couple. While the stars Karan Diwan and Swaran Lata get the close-ups in the song and a place in Bombay film history, narrating a corporeal history of cinema through the dancing girl mobilizes our attention towards other aspects. We learn, for instance, that Azuri trained her vibrant dance partner Krishna Kumar and his brother Robert, who was renamed Surya Kumar, in film dance and choreography, picking them up, she says, from an orphanage and training them till they were perfect dancers, end quote. The brothers went on to choreograph memorable dance numbers in prestige productions like Avara, Pyasa, Nau Do Gyara, etc., carrying Azuri's gestural legacy into big budget films of the 1950s and beyond, even as she was forgotten. We also learned that 2 years prior to Ratan's release, Azuri had introduced the film's music composer Naushad Ali to the producer director A.R. Kardar, giving Naushad his first break as an independent music director in Kardar's 1942 film Nai Dunya. Azuri recalls in an interview, quote, "When Kardar wanted me to choreograph a dance for his film, I told him I wanted a new music director and suggested Naushad. He passed the test and Naushad was made," end quote. While in official histories of Hindi cinema, Naushad's career is celebrated and Azuri is forgotten, corporeal histories pay attention to choreography, rhythm, the need for a new kind of music, for new dance moves, what I refer to as dance musicalization elsewhere in the book. Such a corporeal history excavates the contributions of these occluded figures in the production of Indian cinema's particular sonic and visual attractions. In such a history, Azuri emerges as an eloquent ambassador of this exciting period of flux in dance and cinema through her mobility across cultural, regional, ethnic borders, quite literally mobilizing her dancing body across the stage, the screen, the written word, and from Bombay to Bengal to Tamil Nadu, and in 1947 to post partition Pakistan. And this is the cosmopolitan mobilities that dancing women in particular mobilize that I'm interested in. By the mid 1940s, the popularity of the dance film and of dancing stars began to wane with the rise of the cinematic mode of the social, which attempted to integrate song and dance sequences more seamlessly into the central narrative. Bose's own star text underwent radical transformations during this period. In 1942, she signed her first film with a director other than Madhu Bose, and soon after, she moved into her own apartment in the posh Marine Drive area of Bombay, precipitating a temporary separation between them. Madhu Bose dwells at length on this in his autobiography. Quote, "The reasons for female actors losing balance between home and career are their rising ego and financial independence. The female star feels that taking anyone's advice will hurt her pride and belittle her. This spells doom for her. Waywardness becomes a way of life and she falls into the clutches of insanity." End quote. Madhu Bose's transition to this attitude from his zealous mission in the 1920s to bring girls from respectable families into the theater and cinema speaks volumes about the anxieties regarding the psychological and financial independence accrued to women from participating in the public sphere. This episode directs our attention towards the socio-historical contexts in which the voices of female pioneers in the realm of entertainment are produced and circulated. A consideration of Bose's personal life, including her early resistance, her early insistence on a career in dancing and acting, her marriage and then separation from Madhu Bose, rumors about extravagant parties and promiscuity, and later about a life of penury and destitution, reveals her tenacious resistance to contemporary gender norms, and also the particular imbrications between the personal lives of dancing women and their relationship to the public world of civil and political life. In the 40s, Bose composes a series of stage ballets that are celebrated. During the same period, Azuri's career also evinces mobilities across media and regions. Around 1947, she is reported to have married a Muslim naval officer and moved to Pakistan shortly after partition. Inaugurating the debate about the place of dance in the newly formed Islamic State, she opens the first Academy of Classical Dance in Rawalpindi, despite violent opposition from the Maulvis of the town. She reports this in many of her columns. In her columns in Pakistani newspapers in the 1950s, she negotiates newly forming cultural policies where dance is a thorny issue as it raises the specter of continuities with an occluded Indic past. Adroitly navigating attitudes to dance and female participation in the public sphere, Azuri developed a post partition rhetoric of fashioning an exclusively Islamic dance lineage. She says, "It has taken me 10 years studying the various tribes settled all over Pakistan. The best platform for basing the new dances is to take elements out of the various folk dances which bear the description and integrity of the Muslim race and apply it to the present mood of our thinking. This will be the new dance of Pakistan. I have already named it Pak Raqs or pure dance. End quote. Soon, Azuri became a founding member of the Pakistan American Cultural Center in Karachi and a board member of the National Council of the Arts in Islamabad. The poet Faiz Ahmad Faiz is reported to have said to her, quote, "Your mourners will find even your grave empty as you'll come out of it to dance," end quote. Disappointed with the nascent Pakistani film industry, Azuri quit the movies and started touring internationally with her dance troupe, with well-received tours to Singapore, Malaysia, Australia, Africa, and the UK. In the Pakistani press, she claimed to, quote, "not be too fond of Bharatnatyam dance, which is pure temple dance, compared to Kathak, which originated in the Muslim court of Wajid Ali Shah," end quote. However, a program for her performance in London announces a recital of the 7 types of dancing embodied in 3 techniques, Kathak, Manipuri, and Bharatanatyam. Ravi Vasudevan reads continuities in Punjabi Urdu cinema as, quote, "a counterweight to the ruptures inflicted by the nation state on the idealized integrity of a cultural geography," end quote. Similarly, in Azuri's dance tours, her hybrid Oriental dance blurs the divides wrought by partition, recuperating dance forms as allowing for embodied modes of subcontinental belonging and kinship. In Borders and Boundaries, Women in India's Partition, Ritu Menon and Kamla Bhasin raise the important question, do women have a country? Their feminist historiography of the partition discusses how women were kept out as subjects of this history. In the case of a dancing woman like Azuri, the same question may prompt us to consider the visceral cosmopolitanism of Azuri's multi-hyphenated body that dances across and between borders, a corporeal repository of cultural practices that cannot be partitioned into neat national legacies of Kathak and Bharatnatyam. Through the mobility of dance forms in her repertoire, as well as her physical mobility across borders, Azuri nimbly navigates questions of religious and national identity. After General Ziaul Haq imposed martial law in 1977, disbanding the arts councils, banning dancing by women on stage as un-Islamic, Azuri spent the last 2 decades of her life teaching dance at home and at the station school in Rawalpindi. Across the border in Calcutta, through the 1960s and early 70s, Sadhana Bose reportedly held dance classes in her home as well. Students of both dancers report to have not known that their teachers were once famous dancing stars. Like so many female pioneers in dance, music, and film, including Gauhar Jan, Sulochana or Ruby Myers, Meena Shori, and others, both women are reported to have lived out their last days in penury. However, we must also recognize that these narratives of famed female performers dying penniless are strategically deployed as cautionary tales of moral instruction and obscure these artists' creative acts of self-fashioning and extraordinary resilience. Described as the Pavlova of India at different points in their careers, both Bose and Azuri employed their skills in dance performance and choreography, costume and set design, writing dance columns and autobiographies to assiduously fashion themselves as dancing women, participating in a cosmopolitan transnational dance network that intersected in significant ways with nationalist projects of modernity in the newly formed India and Pakistan. To conclude with a consideration of the moving legacies of both dancer actresses, I want us to consider how situating Azuri and Bose as co-choreographers of new mobilities in the 1930s and 40s alerts us to the material histories of dancing bodies and intersecting narratives of labor, resistance, fame, and erasure. Rather than constructing a history of pitched battles and abrupt innovations, when we consider how the categories of Oriental dancers, classical dancers, traditional performers are intertwined in complex genealogies, we notice how multiple instances of female presence in the public sphere are folding into each other during this and earlier periods. The diverse performance lineages that feed into Bose and Azuri's adventurous hybrid movement vocabularies disrupt linear narratives of female public performance, and deeply enrich histories of female labor and agency in articulating colonial modernity. For instance, reading the Brahmin Bose and Caucasian fearless Nadia alongside each other mobilizes a corporeal analysis of modern Indian womanhood in the late colonial period. As modes of mobility, dance and action sequences serve as central devices in constructing the iconicity of the dancer Bose and the stunt heroine Nadia's bodies as signifiers of national culture and power, respectively. This allows for contradictory and discontinuous relationships between gender, race, and nationalism to prevail. Azuri's gestural genealogies may be traced back, on the other hand, to the Anglo-Indian Eurasian heroine of the 1920s and early 30s, who disappeared with the arrival of the talkie. As a dancing woman featured only in extravagant musical numbers, she did not have significant speaking parts in films. But her dancing body was decidedly voluble, unleashing spectacular energies that altered the representational logics of Hindi cinema. If we trace the lineage of film dancers from Azuri and Shehzadi Begum before her, to Kuku, whom Azuri trained, to Helen, who was trained by Kuku, we write a very different narrative of Bombay cinema, and indeed of South Asian cultural modernities, a corporeal history produced through the interlinked network of these remarkable dancing girls. Women's history, as Joan Kelly notes, has the dual goal of restoring women to history and restoring our history to women. As the authors of significant changes in women's participation in the performing arts, Azuri and Bose had to continuously walk the line between respectability and censure. The construction of their careers at the intersection of the paradigms of modernity and national identity, cosmopolitanism and tradition, demonstrates the complex and dynamic interactions between the categories of gender, nation, and culture during this period. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Usha. That was a very dizzying presentation. There's just so much to process right now. I'm going to give...
Sorry about the technical glitches.
No, I think it worked perfectly. The presentation was beautiful. I'm going to give folks a few minutes to just gather their thoughts and start. Okay, so we already have questions. So Usha, if you don't mind, I'll just jump straight to the first question. And then I have many questions of my own. I'll bring them in as and when time permits. So we have a question from Ankush. Ankush, are you able to unmute yourself? If you would like, we invite you to ask your question directly, if you choose.
Yeah, sure. Basically, I was wondering about two things. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So my first question was, I was wondering if you could explain why you chose the particular time frame from 1930s to 1990s, if I'm correct, for the book.
Yes. Yes.
And the second question is, and this question is beyond the time frame of the book, but I was just curious if you could contextualize and contextualize the post 2000s dancing women or item numbers vis-a-vis their identities and bodies in connection to the talk you gave today. I was just wondering about some continuities that you see or anything new, any interesting figures that stands out for you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thanks so much. I touch on both of these very briefly in the introduction and the epilogue to the book. So in the introduction, I talk about why I start in the 30s, why I start with the talkies. There's been quite, I mentioned, I do some kind of very briefly discuss dance and silent cinema in DG Falke's films in the teens, and then in a film from 1931, Gallant Hearts, where Lalita Pawar has a really interesting dagger dance. And I'm hoping that this kind of formulation of corporeal history, of gestural lineages, will actually help us chart those histories from one dagger dance to another, for example. how does the history change if we kind of think about gestures, if we think about genres and dance modes? So I start in the 1930s. There aren't very many books on dance in Indian cinema, though it's the thing that comes to people's minds when you say Bollywood. So as among the first books to do both a textual as well as a kind of social history of dance in Hindi cinema, I had to kind of be selective in what I chose to write about. And for me, the increased mobility of dancers with the use of the playback system from the mid 1930s made that moment an interesting starting point. So multiple things happened with dance in the 1930s. Before the use of the playback system in the mid 1930s, dancers, I write about this in the introduction, are very static. They have to be rooted to one spot because the mics are placed in multiple places around them in order to catch their voices. And if they moved, then there would be a difference in the sound recording. So the increased mobility with the playback system is one reason I'm starting in the 1930s. This kind of other discursive textualization and Sanskritization of dance forms that's happening in the realm of dance in the 30s is another reason why I'm starting in the 30s. I end in the 90s. Part of this is also fueled by my interest and my fandom. And so Sridevi and Madhuri Dixit for me are the last great dancers of Hindi cinema. I'm sure there are many, and I really enjoy watching, dancers even now. But in the epilogue, I speak about the item dancer as following in this lineage of the heroine vamp figuration that changes in the 1990s, but also come back to Azuri when I'm thinking about Kajrare, for example, I mentioned in the epilogue, as a song that's bringing together the item dance, the mujra, multiple kinds of figurations, the heroine who's now turned item dancer, etc. So these continuities are definitely there, but just for reasons of doability of space, I've restricted myself to that period. And I speak about the post-2000s dancing women in relation to Helen, Kareena Kapoor's kind of redoing of Helen's dance in the remake of Dawn, for example, becomes a way to read the 1950s, 60s, 70s alongside more contemporary Bollywood cinema. So looking very closely at actors and how they're training themselves and how more contemporary dancers go to Bollywood dance schools, how they're required to dance. What also happens from the 90s onwards is the emergence of Bollywood heroes who dance in their own solo dance numbers. So the very gaze, all of it changes from the 1990s. So to talk about the dancing women, the 90s seemed like a good point to stop. But there's also really interesting, exciting work happening on item dancers by other scholars.
Thank you so much, Usha. I mean, I think the question about how technology and cinema as also a technological apparatus also, in your words, reformats certain forms of dance in the 30s, I think is a really fascinating question to consider. We have a bunch of people actually already. I think the next person I should call on is Tejaswini Ganti. Teja, if you're able to unmute.
Yeah, I think I'm already unmuted. Yeah, you can hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, Usha. Thank you so
Teja.
much. This was wonderful. I'm so excited to read your book. And I guess it's a two-part question. It's really about the role of dance in film in terms of expanding the kind of public and audience for dance generally, right? So the more I was thinking about as you were talking, I was realizing that prior to the cinematic, prior to dance on cinema, you would know this history better. I mean, there was really, in terms of seeing dance, right? In terms of a large public, you don't have a large public that is actually exposed to dance, right? Because if you think of like the mudras, if you think of the devdasis, I mean, these are very specific contexts that dance is actually being performed. It's not something, and so I was wondering how you think about the, so the anxiety around dance that is in cinema is possibly because of the, of the quota and the, these areas coming into this, like, this kind of technologically mediated space. But I was wondering how, but at the same time, like in your research, did you find that like was that part of the anxiety around dance, is because of bringing bringing these spaces into this larger platform? But then the second part of it is, I was thinking about when you're talking about how Azudi and Sadhna Bose are performing, I mean, they're touring, right, with dance troupes. That very idea of having dance troupes and touring, I mean, there's a ballet tradition in the West, but within the South Asian context, I'm wondering how much cinema actually produced that very notion of a kind of a stage performance of dance. So yeah, I was just wondering, so it's really looking at, I mean, I guess it's connected to Devashrie's point about the kind of technological mediation, what cinema actually does to dance itself. And I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Absolutely. So in the next chapter, this is what I begin with the founding of the Sangeet Natak Academy.
Okay.
But I'll go back to this history. So in 1927, the ICC committee report, which many of us who work in Indian cinema are familiar with, has these hectic debates about the not respectable, the disrespectable film actress who is typically drawn from the Baiji tradition, the Tawayaf or the Devdasi tradition. So dance is a thing of great anxiety in that moment in 1927. And someone in the ICC report says, except for Bengal, where we have a few instances of cultured ladies, it's all these disreputable women who are polluting the cinema. By the time we come to the 1953 or 54 Sangeet Academy Council seminar on cinema, there is for the first 6 or 7 years, the Sangeet Natak Academy has theater, dance, music, and cinema. And I think it's in 1960 that cinema is no longer part of the academy. But there is a hectic discussion there that Durga Khote, Uday Shankar, all of them participate in. Uday Shankar at that point in the 50s is saying the dance in the films is corrupting real dance, stage dance. Whereas Durga Khote and some other actresses are saying the only reason people are learning, going to your classical dance classes are because of the cinema. So there's a constant back and forth in what is influencing, which one is influencing the others. In Tamil Nadu, for example, Hari Krishnan has a wonderful book called Celluloid Classicism, which is about Bharatanatyam on stage, the Devadasis form of the Sadiratam, and then its performance in Tamil cinema, which continues to have a long history of the representation of Bharatanatyam, and Telugu cinema also. Whereas Bombay cinema has a mix of Kathak, which is both in its classical and mudra forms, and then a kind of Bollywoodized Bharatanatyam and other dance forms. So I spent quite a bit of time in chapter 4 on this, on the Sangeet Natak Academy. But absolutely, there's a raging discussion on how Kamala, Kumari Kamala, who's, Kamala Lakshman, is a lot of even the orthodox magazines like Shruti in Madras are saying the reason for the popularity of Bharatanatyam classes is because of these on-screen dancers. So there's a constant kind of shift, both in terms of respectability of the dancer, the stage dancer, and the film actress, that I then trace into films like Guide and Tisri Kasam in the 50s and 60s. So it's not only a social history, but it's the impact of these women on the imaginary of social melodrama in the 50s and 60s. So that just women's figurations in film, we don't quite realize how much the figure of the dancer has come to articulate that, right? Both a figure of producing great anxiety and great pleasure simultaneously. It's for these reasons that you're saying. On the point about dance troupes, Uday Shankar, Anna Pavlova in the early 20s, when Uday Shankar is an art student in Europe, encourages him. She needs a companion for her Krishna and Radha. And in an earlier moment in America, Ruth St. Dennis, who's performing, various dances, Dance of the Veils, Radha, etc., that she's also picking up from Matchbox and cigarette box covers. So this is a kind of mobilizing of multiple images, Orientalist images, that produces an interest in that early 20th century in the Orient. The Orient as a combination of fabric, fashion, and dance, music, all forming this kind of combination. In 1926, the Denishon Company, which is Ruth St. Dennis and Ted Shawn, tour India. And that's when a lot of middle and upper class Indians sit up and take notice of their own classical dance.
Wow.
And in 1927, Anna Pavlova tours India. She
Wow.
has already danced with Uday Shankar in Europe, but then she also encourages Rukmini Devi Arundale and Madam Menaka, Leela Sokhi to take up Bharatnatyam and Kathak training respectively. So their traditions of the dance troupes are also coming down. And Uday Shankar's dance troupe, which by then is very popular, Ram Gopal, the images that I showed in that 1937 Deepali magazine. So the dance troupe is a formation that is recognized as popular for Oriental dance. It is very much in conversation with cinematic configurations of backup dancers, which I do trace with both folk and classical dance, and how these two are kind of being brought together, as well as sculpture. So it's a whole set of references that are being mobilized, both for stage dance and cinematic dance.
No, it's so rich. Thank you. Congratulations. Really excited for this.
Thank you, Usha, and thank you, Tejaswini. I think we have quite a few people queued up now. So I'll just move to the next question. Priyanka Basu had a question. If Priyanka, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you, Devashri. And thank you, Usha, for that wonderful presentation. I'm yet to read your book. In the context of Azuri and her performances in Pakistan and her initiative in, having a national dance culture for Pakistan, I was wondering if the archives speak at all about this other dancing couple duo from East Pakistan, Bulbul Chaudhary and Afroza Bulbul, who traveled quite a bit between East Pakistan and West Pakistan. And Bulbul Chaudhary's own writings about what should a dancer's mission be in kind of excavating folk forms from both the regions. That speaks, that's quite similar with the sentiments that Azuri herself echoes. So is there any archival traces about the interaction between these performers and artists in the archive?
There is none that I have found. So I'm really excited by your mention of them. And I feel like you need to write about this, Priyanka. Azuri, there is a mention of Azuri having danced, having performed in Dhaka and in East Pakistan more broadly as part of an event that Bashani organizes. I tried at the British Library to look for more kind of evidence of this event, but I wasn't able to find mention even of Azuri over there. But I feel like those are absolutely the places we need to go to, that Azuri takes us to, because she performs in Bengal in the 1930s in two films, but two very prestigious films. It's important to kind of also trace the mobility across West and East Pakistan in this kind of in the 50s that she does. I wasn't able to find anything. Most of the information that I was able to find were about her dance tours in Singapore and Australia, and that was through their newspaper archives, which are really excellent. But they mostly just have reviews of the dance tours, whereas for East Pakistan, I don't have that. So I would love to talk with you more if you have archival materials on Bulbul Chaudhary and Afroza Bulbul, I think you said.
Yes, Afroza Bulbul, her autobiography is there. It's published in Bangla.
It's in Bangla.
And it's in Bangla. And there are quite a few periodicals at the Bangla Academy in Dhaka, and the Bulbul Lalit Kala Academy, which initially started as the Bulbul Academy of Fine Arts. It was started by Afroza Bulbul after Bulbul Chaudhary's death. They might have something. So yeah, we need to talk about this maybe.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Let's continue that conversation.
Thank you so much. I think there's so many ways in which Usha's use of the term mobilities really pushes us also to think also beyond national cinemas and then the standard archives, where we look for histories and genealogies of artistic practice and influence. So thank you both for that. Next up, we have Uttara Kurlawala. If you're able to unmute yourself, please go ahead.
Thank you. It was an amazing presentation. I loved it. I'm fascinated when you mentioned the idea of motifs, movement motifs, traveling through different dances and different films. And I was wondering if you could please speak to that, maybe a couple of examples. That would be very exciting.
Absolutely. I think I saw your mention of the dagger dance. Also, you feature prominently in this chapter and across the book. So thank you so much for your work.
Thank you.
I had expected there to be questions about the Oriental dancer, the figure of the Oriental dancer. And what I'm trying to say here is that Oriental dancers, so many of them, Ruth St. Denis, La Mary, Stella Bloch, all of them are really important to telling this history. And I think Joan Erdman, there is a lot of discussion of how not only were the Devadasis and the Tawayafs erased from this history, but so was the Western Oriental dancer. And so if we kind of move away from the national boundaries and those kinds of discussions without erasing power differentials between all of these mobilizations and appropriations, we can tell some very different stories. But I kind of turn to your discussion of Sanskritization and what that means, the production of the Orient as a refinement of the dance form by adapting costumes and techniques that are suitable for urban sensibilities in this period. In terms of dance motifs, I mentioned the dagger dance kind of in passing, but the dagger dance comes up. I do talk about the question of the agency of the dancer actress and how it changes cinematic narratives altogether. The minute you introduce into your crew, into your film crew, a heroine who can also dance, or a dancing girl, a vamp who is trained in dance and brings these skills that cannot be ignored, the shape of the film itself changes. So you suddenly cannot have a female protagonist who is merely a lover, a mother, a sister, etc. You have to create a narrative so that she can dance, she can show off her dancing. So that dancing women fundamentally change genres and cinematic narratives. And often in the climax of films featuring highly trained dancing heroines like Padmini, Ragini, her sister, Vaijayanti Mala, Wahida Rehman, Sadhna Bose across the films, from what I can make out from the song booklets. The climax of the film, instead of having the male protagonist effect some kind of resolution by killing off the villain, or investigating, etc., all of that work is carried out by the dancing heroine. So in the process of dancing, she will trap the villain, or she will, like you saw in the dagger dance of Ali Baba, she goes and kills the villain. So the dancing mobility is not only in terms of a visual spectacle, but it's also kind of mobilizing and galvanizing narrative events around the body of the woman. And a third way in which it mobilizes is in terms of a techno spectacle, so that the dancing woman demands a certain kind of technological work on the part of the film. In the 50s, I discuss how when Vaijayantimala dances and guide in the snake dance, they had to build a special stage. They had to get a special camera and attendant who would run alongside her with the wires. They had to figure out how to kind of capture this a moving woman and the spectacle that she's generating. So the dancing woman is kind of mobilizing dance, she's mobilizing cinematic narrative, and she's mobilizing celluloid technologies. So there are multiple ways in which these motifs return, and they speak to renewed figurations of female agency in these films.
I think the question of the motifs are also very useful in tracking mobilities, because I was thinking while watching the sequence from Ratan, seeing some films in the 1930s, for example, Bombay talkies as extant films, where there is this kind of assumption of a very set piece kind of dance genre, the dance of the Malan, the Mali and the Malan. And there will be some use of flowers and they will do a set piece. And these are performed in like living rooms in the diegetic world. Which leads me to assume or think that they might be moving from salon spaces like Atiya Faizi's 3 arts circle into cinema. So I think tracking even just those motifs, some set pieces, right, would be a very, very fascinating way of thinking mobilities.
And what you're saying, Debashri, if I could just interject, brings in something that I haven't mentioned in this talk, but is there in the book, which is folk dance. So the continuities of salon dance are very much there in those Malan dances in the 30s, but because you don't want to show the protagonist's family as the sort of, as patrons of salon dancing, which would then invite a certain kind of censure, you have these working class protagonists who are working class dancers who are part of the household, who are performing something in a folk idiom. So that there is often in these films a turn to folk dance to kind of take away all of the censure around traditional hereditary performers.
It's really interesting because in these Bombay Talkies films, the performances are done by college students,
right,
who are putting on a show for someone's birthday or charity fundraising. And they still do this Arabian Nights dance, and then they do a Malan dance, and then they do dance. It's just
yeah.
think through dance, these histories. If I could invite Anupama Kapse now to ask her question.
Thank you, Devi, and congratulations, Usha. I am so excited. This is just fantastic. Wonderful. I cannot wait to read it. I am hoping you can sign a copy in person, and Devi, you also, both of your books. It's just lovely to have this rich conversation back to back, both of your books. So I'm wondering, first of all, the change of the name to Azuri, which is a kind of Islamic marking that's happening through the name. And there is obviously, a sense of solidarity, female solidarity that seems very striking, that is being fostered across the Islamic in her move to Pakistan. But I'm also wondering if that move, that border crossing, enables a different sort of Islamic kit to be articulated, or if there's a bid for a double marking, if you like, that happens through the mobility, the spatial mobility of being in Pakistan as a location. And I'm wondering also if that is happening in the cinema in Pakistan, because you mentioned a dance academy. So we already have, another sort of horizon there begging to be considered as, a field of the Islamic age. So I was just wondering, it's just fascinating. Thank you.
I wish I had examples from that period, but Azuri doesn't. There aren't records of her performance in films made in Pakistan in the 1950s. Much of what, and it's taken me years to even piece together what feels like a coherent narrative, but is likely not. I'm really hoping, there will be people who come and speak into and against and counter to these unfinished histories, because we need the richness of the puzzle to be kind of fully formed. So it's mostly comments. I just found this one really tattered booklet that was published by one of the arts councils on Azuri. It's a collection of her columns in multiple places. Many of them are the Military Gazette. So we don't have a sense of her personal life and she does talk about, and she's constantly framing herself. What I love about her is this chameleonic presence, right? She's mobile. She keeps shape shifting into whatever is required in the new context that she is in. So she does quite a bit. She embraces completely this Islamic figuration now when she is in Pakistan. But the minute she's touring with her dance tours, she becomes the German Indian. So there she wants to recall her training in this Indic past, in the grand traditions of Indian dance forms, Manipuri and Bharatanatyam. But in Pakistan, she's training people only in Kathak. She chooses not to act in the films, but she's constantly kind of, she's producing herself as a Muslim woman. And in the mold of what Sadhana Bose is, it's imposed on Sadhana Bose, the Bhadra Mahila mold, but Azuri takes on some of that as the grand dame of Muslim forms. When she says, I love the authority with which she says, I have already named it Pak Raqs, right? But she's really struggling to get that foothold. And I think she keeps getting marginalized. And we have read Pakistani cinema and this mobility through Noor Jahan mainly, and through voice, right? The mobility of the voice across that goes across with Noor Jahan from Bombay to Lahore. What would it mean for it to be read through a dancing body that goes across? Because that is much harder to accommodate. in these narrative traditions? That is a really important and interesting question. And I don't, Salma Siddiq has worked on Meena Shori and comedy. And I really, for me, what I'm trying to do with dance, I'm hoping kind of provides a framework for us to write about stunts and about comedy, because these are also corporeal inhabitations that carry with them long histories of performance traditions. So those are the only other examples I can think of. And I really have haven't been able to watch any, and I don't have information from the archives of her work in Pakistan. But in all of the images you see her, but also the journalists who go to interview her talk about this kind of decrepit hotel that she lives in, that she has a room in, that it's apparent that she was once, she had a good life across in India. People ask her if she regrets having moved. So there's a really complex story there. And sometimes she says she does regret it. And, but at others, she's still trying to kind of get teaching jobs. Really, the history is coming through various dance blogs where students of Azuri and Sadhna Bose have reported having learned from them. So there is this impassioned, again, embodied fandom that is producing much of the history especially for Azuri.
And thank you so much. That's super articulate and very very detailed. So if I can interject very quickly, it's very hard to do this kind of work, and I just want to note that you trace her to Pakistan. It's hard enough to do archival work. You're doing corporeal work, so congratulations.
Thank you. And I'm hoping Priyanka's question, for example, about East Pakistan just tells us how much there is to do.
So actually, Anupama's last comment helps us move very organically to our last question, which is about the songbooks, the song booklets. So Ryan Pearson, if I could invite you to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by these songbooks that you were referring to. Could you just talk a little bit more about them? I'm especially curious about first how they circulated in relation to like how the film circulated, and then also how kind of their look and composition, impacts the kind of corporeal history that's being done here. So it looked like those pictures were from publicity stills and not necessarily like from frame grabs. So I'm wondering what kind of difference, if any, does it make if you see Azuri making that ballet pose in front of a ballet poster, and that might not be in the final version of the film?
Yep, there was the whole discussion of the archive and song booklets was part of this chapter earlier, and now it isn't because the chapter is already too long. But I do have a paper that I've presented at different places and I plan to publish at some point, which is really a meditation on how do you write a history of dance through static images and text in the song booklets. And there are many historians here of early Indian cinema who all have theorized the absent archive, Debashri Mukherjee, Anupama Kapse, among them, who have thought about what it means. And for me in particular, the question was, how do I imagine the movements? How do I imagine dance, which is particularly kind of implicated in the moving body through these static booklets? The first question about the circulation of the booklets, they were cheaply printed, they were inexpensive, you bought them near the movie theaters where you went to watch. My father, for example, was a collector of song booklets. So a lot of collectors had song booklets with them. And I'm interested in how it kind of created a reading and singing publics alongside, because people would thumb through their song booklets. The song booklets would spend very little time on the plot synopsis at the start. And then it would have lyrics of all of the songs featured in the film in multiple languages. So Hindi, Urdu, Gujarati, Bengali, etc. Right? So multiple reading publics, multiple singing publics, along with the reading of the song booklets. And then these images, because there is an illiterate, fan base for the films that cannot really read, but is returning to the song booklets again and again for the spectacle of the frames, of the something like lobby cards, still images, some of them specially shot for the song booklets. So there, I think about how the static image allows me to produce a gestural history. So I think about what it means for me to never see Sadhana Bose age on screen, because there aren't any films in which I can see her age on screen, but I have the song booklets in which she doesn't age as well. So then I'm left suspended in this place of spectacle. And instead of the importance that actually watching the film would give to the plot and to narrative development, the song booklet allows me to remain suspended in spectacle. So it allows me to write a story of spectacle and of moving bodies, so that the song booklets are central to writing these kinds of corporeal histories. We remain enamored of and stay with gestures in a way that the moving image does not allow us to. So rather than an impoverishment, I'm actually reading it, as many of us have, reading it as helpful in telling a different kind of story of the circulation of cinema not as enshrined in the narrative at all, but in a larger kind of ecology, to use Debashree's term, and an ecology of consumption, of various kinds of consumption.
Thank you.
So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Usha, for a really scintillating talk. And thank you to a very engaged audience. And yes, I'm going to take Uttara's cue, and let's all have a final round of a big, big applause for Usha. Congratulations on your book, and we all look forward to reading it with great care and attention. And I'm just going to paste in the chat information about our next event next Monday at in the morning. In fact, we have a different set of issues being discussed on public health and the pandemic in India. But thank you again so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Usha, so much.
Yeah,
thank you so much, Debashree. Thank you, Catherine Williams, South Asia Institute. Thank you so much.
Bye.
And Usha, I want to mention something to you, which either with or without people here. I texted, but you've been too busy.